Anyone qualified to handle real aviation decisions would be sitting in first class, not slumming it back there with the economy passengers. Richard Blackwood's voice carried across the cabin with the casual cruelty of someone who had never been wrong about anything in his life. The Boeing 747 shuddered through another pocket of turbulence as his gold-rimmed glasses caught the overhead lighting his manicured fingers adjusting his Italian silk tie. Around him, the first-class cabin buzzed with nervous agreement from passengers who paid premium prices to avoid exactly this kind of uncertainty. In seat 7, C-30 Rose, behind the self-appointed aviation expert, Keisha Washington didn't even lift her head from the worn paperback novel balanced on her lap. Her dark fingers turned another page with deliberate calm while conversation swirled around her about delayed connections and missed business meetings. The faded denim jacket draped over her shoulders had seen better decades, and her sneakers showed the kind of wear that spoke of practical necessity rather than fashion choice. Everything about her appearance suggested exactly what Richard Blackwood assumed another economy passenger traveling for family obligations or returning from some modest employment. The coffee cart rattled past her row, its metal wheels catching momentarily on the worn carpet. Flight attendant Paige Scott offered apologetic smiles as she navigated the increasingly restless crowd of 312 passengers, most of whom were checking their phones for weather updates that painted an increasingly grim picture. Outside the oval windows, what had started as routine cloud cover was building into something that made even experienced travelers uncomfortable. Keisha closed her book and placed it carefully in the seat pocket, her movements economical and precise in a way that suggested muscle memory from somewhere other than commercial aviation. She stretched her neck slightly, and for just a moment a thin white scar became visible along her hairline before disappearing again beneath her natural curls, pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her eyes swept the cabin with the kind of systematic assessment that most passengers would attribute to general anxiety, but there was something methodical about how she counted rows to the emergency exits and noted the location of oxygen mask panels above each seat grouping. The intercom crackled to life, interrupting the growing murmur of concerned conversations. Captain Mitchell's voice carried the practiced confidence of someone who had delivered thousands of similar announcements, but passengers who listened carefully might have detected a slight strain beneath the professional calm. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some weather ahead that's going to require us to adjust our altitude and possibly our route to Denver. Nothing to be concerned about, just standard procedure for passenger comfort. We'll have you updated as conditions develop. In the cockpit, 25-year-old co-pilot Evan Brooks was discovering that some situations weren't covered adequately in flight school. The weather radar painted their route in increasingly angry shades of red and yellow, and Captain Mitchell was pressing his palm against his chest in a way that Brooks had never seen during their previous flights together. The veteran pilot's face had taken on a grayish pallor that had nothing to do with the storm system building ahead of them. "Captain, should we request a different altitude from air traffic control?" Brooks asked, his voice carrying the careful deference of someone still establishing credibility in the cockpit hierarchy. Mitchell nodded slowly, but when he reached for the radio controls, his hand trembled slightly. "Roger that, Evan. You handle the communication. I need to check something in the manual." Brooks keyed the microphone, his own voice steady, despite the growing concern in his chest. "Denver Center United, 478, requesting flight level 360 due to weather." The response came back immediately, but it wasn't what they wanted to hear. "United 478 negative on the altitude change. Traffic above and below your position. Maintain flight level 380 and prepare for possible holding pattern." Back in the cabin, conversations were shifting from mild annoyance to genuine worry as passengers noticed the increasing frequency of turbulence bumps and the way their drinks were sloshing in their cups with each atmospheric disturbance. Richard Blackwood had appointed himself the unofficial spokesperson for first-class concerns, his voice carrying back through the cabin as he explained to anyone within earshot exactly how these situations should be properly managed. The problem with these regional storm systems, he announced to the elderly couple in the seats across from him, is that most pilots don't have experience with real weather management. I've flown through conditions like this dozens of times in private aircraft with truly qualified pilots. The key is assertive decision-making and proper equipment utilization. His wife Victoria shifted uncomfortably beside him, her expression suggesting she had heard variations of this expertise lecture many times before. Richard, perhaps we should just trust that the pilots know what they're doing. Trust. Richard's laugh carried a sharp edge. Victoria, I didn't build a multi-million-dollar investment firm by trusting other people's competence without verification. These commercial pilots are trained for routine operations, not complex problem-solving. Several rows ahead, Dr. Catherine Reed was making her own professional assessment of the situation. As a neurosurgeon who had spent years reading subtle signs of medical distress, she noticed that Captain Mitchell's brief appearances in the cabin showed classic indicators of cardiovascular stress. His breathing seemed shallow, and he was favoring his left arm in a way that triggered her medical instincts. She made a mental note to introduce herself if the situation warranted professional intervention. Keisha Washington was conducting her own quiet analysis, though her observations were focused on different details than the medical professional nearby. She had noticed that the flight attendants were checking their watches more frequently, and that their routine beverage service had been quietly suspended. More significantly, she could feel the subtle changes in engine rhythm and aircraft attitude that suggested the pilots were making continuous adjustments to maintain stable flight through increasingly challenging conditions. Her fingers drummed a specific pattern on her armrest, 15-second intervals that corresponded to the frequency of moderate turbulence encounters. Most passengers would attribute such timing to nervous habit, but Keisha was actually conducting an atmospheric assessment based on turbulence patterns that indicated wind shear probability and storm cell density. It was the kind of knowledge that came from experience with weather systems that could kill you if you miscalculated their intensity. The intercom crackled again, but this time, Captain Mitchell's voice carried a tremor that made everyone in the cabin stop their conversations and listen. Flight attendants, please take your seats immediately and ensure all passengers are securely fastened with seat belts. We're encountering some significant weather that requires our full attention in the cockpit. Paige Scott moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, but Keisha noticed the flight attendant's hands were checking seatbelt tension with extra care, and her eyes were scanning for any loose items that could become projectiles during severe turbulence. These were the actions of someone who had been briefed on potential emergency procedures, not just routine weather precautions. The aircraft suddenly dropped what felt like several feet before stabilizing, causing gasps and nervous laughter throughout the cabin. Several passengers grabbed their armrests, and one woman near the back started crying softly. Richard Blackwood used the moment to reinforce his position as the cabin's authority on aviation matters. What we're experiencing is classic downdraft turbulence, he explained to anyone listening. The pilot should be requesting immediate clearance to a higher altitude where the air mass is more stable. It's basic meteorological procedure. Harold Peterson, a retired Marine sitting in row 12, turned slightly in his seat. His weathered face carried the kind of skepticism that came from decades of distinguishing between actual expertise and confident incompetence. "You've been through this kind of weather before," he asked Richard directly. "More times than I can count," Richard replied without hesitation. Private aviation gives you exposure to decision-making processes that commercial passengers never see. I've observed flight operations in conditions that would challenge most commercial pilots. Harold nodded slowly, but said nothing. His own experience with weather-related emergencies had taught him the difference between observing operations and actually conducting them under pressure. He had also noticed something that the self-appointed aviation expert had missed: the young woman in economy who was timing the turbulence intervals and whose posture suggested familiarity with high-stress environments. The storm system was intensifying faster than the Weather Service had predicted, and in the cockpit, Captain Mitchell was struggling with symptoms that he was trying desperately to manage without alarming his co-pilot. His vision was becoming intermittently blurry, and the chest pressure that had started as mild discomfort was now a persistent ache that made it difficult to concentrate on the increasingly complex weather navigation decisions required for safe flight. "Evan," he said quietly, "I need you to handle the radio communications while I review our fuel options. This storm is larger than our original routing anticipated." Brooks nodded, but he was beginning to recognize that something beyond weather concerns was affecting his captain's performance. Mitchell's responses were becoming delayed, and his usual decisive command presence was replaced by an uncharacteristic hesitancy that made the young co-pilot's stomach tighten with worry. Keisha Washington heard the subtle changes in engine tone that indicated power adjustments for weather penetration, and she unconsciously adjusted her breathing to the rhythm that pilots use to maintain calm during high-stress flight operations. Her left hand moved briefly to her neck, where her fingers found the thin chain that disappeared beneath her collar. For just a moment, a small metal object caught the cabin, lighting something that looked like it might be a coin or medallion before disappearing again under her jacket. The aircraft shuddered through another series of turbulence encounters, and this time the overhead bins rattled in a way that made several passengers look up nervously. The fastened seatbelt sign had been illuminated for 20 minutes, but now the flight attendants were moving through the cabin with the kind of urgency that suggested preparation for something more serious than routine weather delays. Richard Blackwood noticed the increased activity and decided this was the perfect opportunity to demonstrate his aviation knowledge to the nervous passengers around him. What they should be doing, he announced loudly enough for multiple rows to hear, is requesting priority routing around this weather system. Any qualified pilot would have made that decision 15 minutes ago. His commentary was interrupted by a sound that made everyone in the cabin freeze: the sharp electronic chime that preceded emergency announcements. When co-pilot Evan Brooks' voice came through the speakers, the practiced calm was gone, replaced by something that made parents instinctively reach for their children's hands. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a medical emergency in the cockpit. Captain Mitchell is experiencing a serious health incident, and I need immediate assistance from anyone on board with military aviation experience. We are currently flying through a Category 5 storm system, and I have never handled conditions like this without supervision." The silence that followed was absolute. 312 passengers processed the implications of what they had just heard. They were trapped in a storm that was beyond the capabilities of their remaining pilot, and their survival depended on whether someone in the cabin had skills that nobody knew about. If you're feeling that gut punch of realization right now, that moment when everything changes in an instant, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about judging people by their appearance. Richard Blackwood was the first to recover from the shock, and his response was exactly what everyone expected from someone who had spent the entire flight establishing his aviation credentials. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a situation he couldn't handle through sheer force of personality. "Flight attendant," he called toward the front of the cabin, "I have extensive aviation experience as a passenger in private aircraft. I've observed flight operations in challenging weather conditions throughout Europe and North America. I can provide assistance to your co-pilot." Paige Scott hurried toward him, her training warring with the desperate hope that someone, anyone, might be able to help. "Sir, we specifically need someone with military flight training. The conditions we're flying through require combat aviation experience." Are you questioning my qualifications? Richard's voice carried the indignant tone of someone who wasn't accustomed to having his expertise challenged. I've logged over 200 hours as a passenger in sophisticated aircraft. I understand weather navigation and emergency procedures better than most people in this cabin. Several passengers were now looking around, hopefully searching for any indication that someone might possess the specific skills their situation required. A few were already typing what looked like farewell messages on their phones, while others were clutching religious symbols or family photos. The reality of their situation was sinking in. They were 40,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean in a storm that was overwhelming their pilot, and their survival might depend on the chance that someone with combat flying experience happened to be traveling in economy class. In Seat 7, Keisha Washington was listening to every word while conducting her own rapid assessment of the emergency. Her fingers found the small metal object beneath her collar again, and she was making calculations that had nothing to do with passenger anxiety and everything to do with atmospheric conditions, fuel consumption rates, and the mathematical probability of successful storm navigation by someone without experience in extreme weather operations. She had noticed details that other passengers missed. The specific way the aircraft was responding to control inputs suggested the autopilot was struggling with wind shear conditions, and the sound profile of the engines indicated they were operating at power settings, typically reserved for emergency situations. More concerning was the intermittent nature of radio communications with air traffic control, which suggested that the storm system was interfering with navigation equipment in ways that would make instrument flying extremely challenging for anyone without extensive experience in degraded conditions. Harold Peterson was watching the young woman with growing interest. His Marine Corps experience had taught him to recognize composure under pressure, and while everyone else in the cabin was showing various levels of panic or bravado, she was displaying the kind of calm assessment that came from training in life or death situations. There was something about her posture and breathing pattern that reminded him of combat veterans he had known, people who had learned to function effectively when failure meant death. Dr. Catherine Reed had made her way forward to assess Captain Mitchell's condition, and her brief report to the flight attendants was overheard by several passengers. Acute cardiovascular episode, possibly myocardial infarction. He needs immediate medical intervention, but more critically, he will not be able to resume flight duties under any circumstances. The medical diagnosis hit the cabin like a physical blow. Whatever hope remained that their captain might recover enough to resume control of the aircraft was now eliminated. They were entirely dependent on a co-pilot who had just admitted he was overwhelmed by conditions beyond his experience level. Richard Blackwood seized the moment to reinforce his position as the only viable solution to their crisis. "This is exactly why I need to get to that cockpit immediately," he declared to the flight attendants and anyone else listening. "We can't afford to waste time on theoretical qualifications when we need practical decision-making." "Sir," Paige Scott tried again. The co-pilot specifically requested someone with military combat aviation training. "These storm conditions require—" "I understand storm conditions," Richard interrupted. "I've flown through weather systems that would challenge most commercial pilots. My brother-in-law operates a charter service specializing in difficult weather operations. I've observed his procedures dozens of times." Marcus Wellington, another first-class passenger who had been listening to Richard's expertise demonstrations throughout the flight, stood up to support his newfound ally. "He's absolutely right. We need someone who understands command decision-making, not just technical procedures. Military training is fine, but business aviation requires adaptability and leadership skills." Diana Cross, who had been discreetly filming the emergency response with her phone, added her voice to the growing consensus among the first-class passengers. "Does anyone here actually believe that someone with real pilot qualifications would be traveling in economy class? We need to be realistic about who has the background to handle this situation." The comment hung in the air with the kind of ugly assumption that revealed more about the speakers than they intended. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably, while others nodded agreement with the logical sounding argument that expertise and economic status were naturally correlated. Keisha Washington finally moved unbuckling her seatbelt with the same economic precision that had characterized all her actions during the flight. She stood slowly, her movements drawing attention not because they were dramatic, but because they were so controlled they seemed to create a pocket of calm in the increasingly chaotic cabin environment. "Excuse me," she said to Paige Scott, her voice carrying easily through the cabin without being raised. "Colonel Keisha Washington, United States Air Force, 500 hours flight time in F-22, Raptor Specialist in Extreme Weather Navigation and Emergency Recovery Operations." The effect of her words was immediate and complete silence. Richard Blackwood's mouth opened slightly as he processed what he had just heard, while Marcus Wellington and Diana Cross exchanged glances that suggested they were recalculating everything they had assumed about their fellow passengers. "I need to speak with your co-pilot immediately." Kesha continued her tone, carrying the kind of authority that made people move without thinking about whether they wanted to comply. "Time is critical, and storm systems like this one deteriorate rapidly once they reach Category 5 intensity." Harold Peterson felt a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as he watched the first-class passengers struggle to process this development. His marine instincts had been correct. The quiet woman in economy class was exactly what she appeared to be, which was nothing like what anyone had assumed. Dr. Catherine Reed looked up from her medical assessment with relief and professional recognition. "Colonel, I'm Dr. Reed, neurosurgery. Captain Mitchell has suffered what appears to be a major cardiac event. He's stable, but completely incapacitated. Your co-pilot is going to need immediate support." "Understood, doctor. Please continue monitoring the captain's condition." Keisha was already moving toward the cockpit, her stride covering the cabin length with the efficiency of someone accustomed to moving quickly through confined spaces under emergency conditions. Richard Blackwood recovered his voice as she passed his seat. "Wait just a minute. Anyone can claim military rank. I demand to see proper credentials before we entrust our lives to someone who obviously doesn't belong in a position of authority." The words stopped Kesha mid-stride, and when she turned to face him, several passengers later said they felt the temperature in the cabin drop several degrees. Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes made Richard take an involuntary step backward. "Mr. Blackwood," she said quietly, "there are 3 types of pilots in this world. Those who fly when conditions are easy, those who fly when conditions are difficult, and those who fly when conditions are impossible." She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "I'm the only person on this aircraft who has ever flown through enemy territory with 2 engines, failed navigation systems destroyed, and surface-to-air missiles targeting my aircraft. And I brought my entire squadron home." The cabin fell silent except for the continued rumble of the storm outside and the occasional creak of the aircraft structure under stress. Several passengers were now staring at Richard with expressions that ranged from embarrassment to outright anger at his continued challenges to their potential salvation. But Richard wasn't finished. The investment in his own expertise was too significant to abandon without a fight, and the implied criticism of his judgment was intolerable to someone who had built his identity around being right about people and situations. "That's a very impressive story," he said, his voice carrying the patronizing tone reserved for situations where he felt his authority was being questioned by someone he considered fundamentally unqualified. But stories are easy to tell when there's no way to verify them. "I'm not willing to bet my life and my wife's life on unsubstantiated claims from someone who clearly lacks the proper credentials for this situation." Victoria Blackwood touched her husband's arm gently. "Richard, perhaps we should..." No, Victoria. I'm not going to remain silent while our safety is compromised by political correctness. He turned back to Kesha, his voice rising. If you really have the qualifications you claim, then you should have no problem providing proper documentation and submitting to verification procedures before taking control of this aircraft. Trevor Nash, another business class passenger, felt emboldened by Richard's stance. He's absolutely right. We need verification of credentials, not just verbal claims. This is a life or death situation that requires proper authorization. The storm chose that moment to remind everyone of the urgency of their situation. The aircraft dropped suddenly, causing several passengers to cry out, and the lights flickered as electrical systems struggled with atmospheric interference. Through the windows, lightning was now visible as continuous flashes and the sound of rain against the fuselage had intensified to the point where normal conversation was becoming difficult. Co-pilot Evan Brooks appeared at the cockpit door, his face pale with stress and his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Is there anyone with military aviation experience? Captain Mitchell is unconscious. Our weather radar is showing interference patterns, and I'm seeing indications that suggest we're dealing with wind shear conditions that exceed normal operational parameters. Kesha moved toward him immediately. Colonel Washington, United States Air Force, I need current altitude, airspeed, fuel status, and your assessment of navigation system functionality. Brooks' relief was visible as he automatically responded to the command authority in her voice. Flight level 380. Airspeed 450 knots, fuel remaining approximately 90 minutes at current consumption, and our GPS navigation is showing intermittent signal loss. Richard Blackwood laughed, the sound sharp and bitter in the tense cabin atmosphere. Impressive. She memorized some basic aviation terminology. That doesn't qualify her to take control of a commercial aircraft with 300 passengers on board. Sir, Brooks said desperately, we specifically need someone with military experience. These storm conditions are beyond anything I've encountered in commercial aviation training. And I'm telling you that you're being manipulated by someone who clearly lacks proper qualifications, Richard shot back. Look at her. Does she look like someone who commands fighter aircraft? We need real expertise, not diversity theater. The words hit the cabin like a physical slap. Several passengers audibly gasped while others looked away in embarrassment. Harold Peterson started to stand his Marine Corps training, making it difficult to listen to fellow service members being disrespected, but Keisha caught his eye and shook her head slightly. She had dealt with this kind of challenge throughout her military career, and she knew that arguing would only waste time they couldn't afford. Instead, she turned to Brooks and began demonstrating exactly why the Air Force had trusted her with their most advanced aircraft. Co-pilot Brooks, I need you to request emergency clearance to flight level 360. The storm cell we're encountering has a thermal inversion layer at approximately 39,000 feet that's creating the wind shear conditions. Below that altitude, we'll find more stable air mass. Brooks nodded and reached for his radio, but Richard wasn't finished with his opposition campaign. Don't listen to her, he called out loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear. She's making up technical terminology to sound credible. I've flown through weather systems like this with actually qualified pilots, and the proper procedure is to climb above the storm, not descend into it. Mr. Blackwood, Keisha said, her voice still calm, but now carrying an edge that made several passengers straighten in their seats. Thermal inversion layers in Category 5 storm systems create updraft conditions above 39,000 feet that can exceed the structural limits of commercial aircraft. Descent to a lower altitude utilizes the pressure differential to stabilize flight control responsiveness. She continued, without waiting for his response, turning back to Brooks. Additionally, we need to adjust our heading by approximately 15 degrees to parallel the storm's movement pattern rather than fighting directly through the core circulation. Brooks was already implementing her instructions, and the effect was immediate. The violent pitching and rolling that had characterized their flight for the past 20 minutes began to smooth out as they found the more stable air mass she had predicted. Richard felt his certainty wavering as the aircraft's improved stability contradicted his assumption that her instructions were improvised nonsense. But he had invested too much of his credibility in opposing her to back down now, especially in front of the passengers who had been listening to his aviation expertise throughout the flight. "Anyone can get lucky with weather patterns," he declared, though his voice carried less conviction than before. "What we need is someone with documented experience and proper certification, not guesswork that happened to work temporarily." Dr. Catherine Reed, who had been listening to the entire exchange while monitoring Captain Mitchell's condition, finally spoke up with the precision of someone accustomed to life-or-death decision-making. "Mr. Blackwood, I've worked with military pilots in trauma situations for over 15 years. Colonel Washington's terminology response patterns and decision-making process are consistent with advanced aviation training. More importantly, her instructions have demonstrably improved our flight stability." Dr. Reed. Richard replied, his tone suggesting he felt betrayed by what he perceived as another professional joining forces against him. "Medical training doesn't qualify you to assess aviation competence. We need verification from proper aviation authorities before allowing unqualified personnel to take control of this aircraft." The storm system chose that moment to demonstrate why time was more critical than bureaucratic verification procedures. A massive downdraft caught the aircraft, dropping them several hundred feet in seconds and causing the overhead bins to rattle violently. Several passengers screamed, and the sound of personal items crashing to the floor mixed with the roar of wind outside the aircraft. Emergency oxygen masks deployed throughout the cabin as the aircraft's altitude control systems struggled to maintain stable flight. The sudden appearance of yellow oxygen masks dangling from the ceiling panels had an immediate psychological effect. This was no longer just severe weather. This was a genuine emergency where people might die. Keisha moved with practiced efficiency, helping nearby passengers with their oxygen masks, while simultaneously conducting a visual assessment of the cabin for any structural stress indicators. Her movements were so smooth and automatic that several people later commented it was like watching someone who had performed these exact actions many times before under similar circumstances. "Brooks," she called toward the cockpit, "we need to establish communication with air traffic control on emergency frequency 121.5. Standard communication channels are being disrupted by electromagnetic interference from the storm system." The co-pilot nodded and began adjusting radio frequencies, but Richard Blackwood was now facing a crisis of his own. The deployment of emergency oxygen masks had made it impossible to deny the severity of their situation, and the woman he had been opposing was demonstrating knowledge and competence that was becoming harder to dismiss as coincidence or lucky guessing. But admitting error at this point would mean acknowledging that he had potentially endangered everyone's lives by opposing someone who might be their only hope for survival. His business success had been built on projecting confidence and authority, and backing down now would undermine everything he believed about his own judgment and expertise. "This is exactly what I was concerned about," he announced to the cabin, his voice carrying the desperate edge of someone who was running out of rational arguments. "We're in an emergency situation because we allowed unqualified personnel to experiment with flight procedures instead of following established protocols." Several passengers turned to stare at him with expressions of disbelief and anger. The improved flight stability following Keisha's instructions was obvious to everyone on board, and his continued opposition was beginning to look less like legitimate concern and more like dangerous obstruction. Harold Peterson had heard enough. "Son," he said, his Marine Corps command voice cutting through the cabin noise, "I've been listening to you run your mouth for the past hour, and I can tell you right now that the colonel is the real deal. I suggest you sit down, shut up, and let her do her job." "And what exactly qualifies you to make that assessment?" Richard shot back his frustration, now overriding his judgment. Are you another one of these self-proclaimed military experts? Harold smiled grimly. Gunnery Sergeant Harold Peterson, United States Marine Corps, retired. 30 years of experience working with Air Force pilots in combat situations. And I'm telling you that you're interfering with someone who's trying to save your life. The exchange was interrupted by Brooks's voice over the intercom, and the stress in his tone made everyone stop talking immediately. Ladies and gentlemen, we've lost contact with air traffic control due to storm interference, and our weather radar is showing that the storm system has intensified beyond Category 5 levels. We're currently flying through conditions that exceed normal operational parameters, and we need everyone to remain seated with oxygen masks in place. Richard felt the blood drain from his face as the full implications of their situation became clear. They were flying blind through a storm system that was beyond anything in commercial aviation training, with a co-pilot who had admitted he was overwhelmed, and he had spent the crisis opposing the one person who might have the experience to get them through it alive. But even as his rational mind recognized the reality of their situation, his emotional investment in being right about people and situations made it impossible to simply admit error and step aside. Too much of his identity was wrapped up in his ability to assess competence and make correct judgments about who belonged in positions of authority. We still need proper verification of credentials, he said, though his voice now carried a note of desperation rather than confidence. Military service records, pilot certification, something that proves she has the authority to take control of this aircraft. Kesha had been listening to the entire argument while conducting her own assessment of their situation, and she finally turned to address Richard directly. Her expression was calm, but something in her eyes suggested that his continued interference was testing the limits of her patience. "Mr. Blackwood," she said quietly, "I understand your concern about verification, but right now we have approximately 60 minutes of fuel remaining before we reach critical levels. Our navigation systems are compromised, and we're flying through weather conditions that are deteriorating faster than commercial aviation protocols can accommodate." She paused, letting the timeline sink in before continuing. "You can continue demanding documentation while we fall out of the sky, or you can allow me to use 15 years of combat aviation experience to get everyone on this aircraft safely on the ground. The choice is yours, but physics doesn't care about your verification preferences." The cabin fell silent except for the continued roar of the storm and the rhythmic breathing sounds of passengers using their oxygen masks. Through the windows, lightning was now constant, and the aircraft was shaking with the kind of continuous vibration that suggested they were fighting atmospheric forces at the edge of their structural capabilities. Richard looked around the cabin and saw expressions that ranged from hope focused on Kesha to anger directed at him. His wife, Victoria, was staring at him with a mixture of embarrassment and fear, while other passengers were openly glaring at his continued obstruction of their potential salvation. But he had gone too far to back down gracefully, and his businessman's instinct was telling him that admitting total error in judgment would be more damaging than continuing to fight for his position. Sometimes he had learned you had to double down on your decisions, even when they were starting to look questionable. "I'm not going to apologize for demanding proper procedures in a life-or-death situation," he declared, his voice carrying the defensive tone of someone who was running out of rational arguments. "If she really has the qualifications she claims, then verification should be simple and straightforward. You're watching someone's entire worldview crash in real time, but with lives hanging in the balance, what would you do in this moment? Trust the evidence or stick with first impressions? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments below." The aircraft shuddered through another massive downdraft, and this time the structural stress was visible as overhead panels flexed and luggage compartments groaned under the strain. Several passengers were now openly crying, while others were gripping their armrests with white-knuckled intensity as the reality of their situation became impossible to deny. Captain Mitchell remained unconscious despite Dr. Reed's continued medical attention, and through the open cockpit door, passengers could see co-pilot Brooks struggling with controls that were responding sluggishly to his inputs. The weather radar screen was now showing solid red across their entire flight path, indicating storm intensity that exceeded the aircraft's certified operational limits. Keisha Washington looked around the cabin one final time, assessing the fear and desperation in the faces of 312 people whose lives now depended on decisions that had to be made in the next few minutes. She had spent her military career in situations where delay meant death, and she recognized that they had reached the point where discussion time was over. "Brooks," she called toward the cockpit, "I'm coming forward. We need to establish emergency communication protocols and begin descent procedures before fuel levels reach critical status." "Colonel, please." Brooks replied, his voice tight with stress and relief. "I need immediate assistance with navigation and weather assessment." As she moved toward the cockpit, Richard Blackwood made one final desperate attempt to maintain his position as the cabin's authority on proper procedures. "This is insanity," he shouted loud enough for everyone to hear. "We're allowing someone with no verified credentials to take control of our lives based on unsubstantiated claims and lucky guesses." Keisha stopped and turned back to face him, and this time several passengers saw something in her expression that made them understand they were looking at someone who had faced much worse storms than the one raging outside their windows. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying the kind of calm that comes from absolute certainty, "you're absolutely right that credentials matter. When we reach the ground, and we will reach the ground, I'll be happy to show you exactly why the United States Air Force trusted me with their most advanced aircraft and their most impossible missions." She paused, her gaze sweeping the cabin to include all the passengers who were listening. "But right now, the only credential that matters is the ability to keep this aircraft flying through conditions that are trying very hard to kill us all. And I'm the only person on board who has ever done that before." Without waiting for a response, she disappeared into the cockpit, leaving behind a cabin full of passengers who were finally beginning to understand that they might be witnessing something far more significant than a routine aviation emergency. Richard Blackwood remained standing in the aisle, his expensive suit wrinkled and his confidence shattered as the woman he had dismissed as unqualified took control of their survival with the kind of competence that would haunt his assumptions for the rest of his life. The cockpit was a maze of flashing warning lights and urgent electronic alarms that painted Evan Brooks's face in alternating shades of red and amber. His hands trembled over controls that seemed to be fighting against every input. While outside the windscreen, the world had disappeared into a wall of black clouds illuminated by continuous lightning strikes that turned night into strobing day. Captain Mitchell lay unconscious in his seat, his breathing shallow but steady under Dr. Reed's continued monitoring. The heart rate monitor attached to his chest beeped with mechanical regularity, a stark contrast to the chaos surrounding them as the Boeing 747 fought through atmospheric conditions that exceeded every parameter in commercial aviation manuals. Keisha Washington slipped into the cockpit with the fluid efficiency of someone who had entered dozens of similar high-stress environments. Her eyes immediately scanning the instrument panel with the systematic assessment of a pilot trained to process critical information under life-threatening pressure. The artificial horizon showed their aircraft in a continuous battle with wind shear forces, while the weather radar painted their entire flight path in angry shades of red that indicated storm intensity beyond normal measurement scales. "Current fuel status?" she asked Brooks, her voice cutting through the electronic cacophony with professional calm. 58 minutes at current consumption." Brooks replied his relief at having competent assistance evident despite the stress fractures in his voice. But consumption is increasing due to power requirements for weather penetration. Keisha nodded her fingers, already moving over secondary controls to assess their situation. The navigation display showed their position as a small blinking dot surrounded by weather returns that looked like a meteorological apocalypse, while radio communications crackled with static that indicated electromagnetic interference from the storm system. We need to establish contact on military emergency frequency 121.5, she said, adjusting radio controls with movements that suggested muscle memory from thousands of similar procedures. Commercial frequencies are being overwhelmed by atmospheric interference. Brooks watched her work with growing confidence as she demonstrated the kind of systematic problem-solving that came from training in environments where mistakes were measured in lives lost rather than inconvenience caused. Her hands moved over the controls with precision that made complex procedures look routine, while her eyes continuously scanned instruments in patterns that suggested she was processing multiple data streams simultaneously. Emergency frequency active. Brooks reported as static cleared to reveal the crisp professionalism of military air traffic control. Kesha keyed the microphone with the confidence of someone who had made similar calls from aircraft that were far more damaged than their current situation. Andrews Air Force Base. This is Colonel Kesha Washington aboard United Flight 478 requesting emergency assistance and identity verification. The response came immediately, cutting through atmospheric interference with the clarity that indicated priority communication protocols. Colonel Washington, call sign Spectre, is that actually you? This is Commander Rodriguez Andrews' military approach control. We show your aircraft disappeared from radar contact 23 minutes ago. The effect of that radio transmission on the cabin was immediate and profound. Richard Blackwood, who had been standing near the cockpit door, continuing his opposition campaign, felt his knees buckle as the implications of what he had just heard crashed over him like a physical blow. The woman he had been dismissing as unqualified was being addressed by military air traffic control with the kind of recognition reserved for pilots whose reputations preceded them into emergency situations. Andrews, base affirmative on identity. Keisha replied with the calm professionalism that came from years of communication under combat conditions. We have simultaneous medical and weather emergency. Captain incapacitated flying through Category 5+ storm system with navigation systems compromised, requesting priority emergency landing clearance nearest facility capable of handling Boeing 747. Spectre, you have absolute priority on all frequencies, Commander Rodriguez responded immediately. We're clearing entire East Coast airspace for your approach. What's your assessment of landing capability under current conditions? Harold Peterson, who had moved closer to hear the radio communications, felt a grim smile cross his weathered face as he watched Richard Blackwood's expression transform from skeptical opposition to dawning horror at the magnitude of his misjudgment. The Marine veteran had seen enough combat to recognize the difference between genuine expertise and confident incompetence, and the military controller's immediate response to Keisha's call sign told him everything he needed to know about her actual qualifications. Andrews, we need Dover Air Force Base emergency services standing by. Keisha continued, her hands simultaneously working flight controls to maintain stable heading through wind conditions that were trying to tear the aircraft apart. Medical emergency requires immediate cardiovascular intervention and will need full emergency response for potential structural stress landing. Spectre Dover is rolling all emergency equipment, came the immediate response. Fire rescue medical and crash recovery teams are positioning. Additionally, we're patching you through to General Patricia Hayes' Pentagon Air Operations Command. The mention of Pentagon-level attention made several passengers who were listening to the cockpit communications realize They were witnessing something far beyond a routine aviation emergency. General officers didn't personally involve themselves in individual aircraft situations unless the pilot was someone whose loss would have national security implications. A new voice came through the radio with the crisp authority that characterized senior military leadership. Colonel Washington, this is General Hayes. We have confirmation of your identity and service record. Is it accurate that you successfully guided 17 aircraft to safe recovery during your combat deployments? Affirmative, General. Keisha replied while simultaneously adjusting power settings to compensate for increasing headwind resistance. Multiple scenarios involving aircraft damage, navigation failure, and hostile weather conditions. Current situation is challenging, but manageable with proper approach procedures. Richard Blackwood was now leaning against the cabin wall for support as the full scope of his error became undeniable. The woman he had spent the past hour dismissing as unqualified was not only a legitimate military pilot, but someone whose record warranted personal attention from Pentagon leadership during an emergency situation. His investment firm's success had been built on his ability to assess people and situations accurately, and the magnitude of his misjudgment was destroying everything he believed about his own competence. Spectre, we're showing storm intensification beyond predicted parameters, General Hayes continued. All civilian airports in your operational area have suspended operations due to wind conditions exceeding aircraft certification limits. You're currently the only aircraft airborne in the entire northeastern corridor. Doctor. Catherine Reed, who had been monitoring the radio communications while continuing her medical assessment of Captain Mitchell, looked up with professional recognition. Colonel, I need to inform you that the captain's condition has stabilized, but he will require immediate surgical intervention upon landing. The stress of continued flight operations could trigger additional cardiac episodes. Understood, Doctor. Keisha replied, her concentration never wavering from the complex navigation decisions required to keep them airborne. General Hayes, we need Dover Emergency Medical standing by for immediate cardiac surgery capability. Already arranged, Spectre. Additionally, we're curious about your assessment of current atmospheric conditions. Our meteorology teams are showing readings that exceed their instrumentation capability. Keisha smiled grimly as she processed weather data that confirmed what her combat experience had already told her about the storm system they were fighting. General, this system is generating wind shear patterns similar to those I encountered during Operation Tempest Shield in Afghanistan, but with the added complexity of oceanic thermal dynamics. We're dealing with atmospheric instability that requires non-standard approach procedures. Are you referring to the mission where you guided a damaged C-130 through a sandstorm using only radio communication? General Hayes asked, her voice carrying a note of professional curiosity. Similar principles, different atmospheric variables. Keisha confirmed as she began calculating approach angles that would have been impossible for most pilots to conceptualize, much less execute. The key is understanding how pressure differentials interact with aircraft control surfaces under extreme conditions. Brooks watched her work with growing amazement as she demonstrated knowledge that went far beyond anything in commercial aviation training. Her approach to the storm system wasn't based on avoiding dangerous conditions, but on understanding and utilizing atmospheric forces that other pilots would consider prohibitively hazardous. Marcus Wellington, who had been one of Richard's most vocal supporters in questioning Keisha's qualifications, was now staring at the radio communications with the expression of someone who realized he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. His business background had taught him to recognize expertise when he encountered it, and the military controller's treatment of Keisha indicated that she was operating at levels of competence that he had never experienced personally. Spectre, we're also receiving reports that you successfully recovered 17 aircraft during your deployment operations. General Hayes continued. Can you confirm those missions involved aircraft recovery under combat conditions? Affirmative, General. Multiple scenarios, including surface-to-air missile damage, navigation system failure, and hostile weather operations in terrain that prohibited standard emergency procedures. Kesha's hands continued their precise dance over the controls as she spoke, her multitasking ability demonstrating the kind of cognitive processing that came from years of operating in environments where single mistakes meant death for entire crews. Richard Blackwood felt his worldview collapsing as he processed the implications of what he was hearing. The woman he had judged incapable of understanding aviation procedures was being discussed by Pentagon leadership as someone whose combat record included successfully recovering aircraft under conditions that would have been impossible for most military pilots, much less civilian operators. The storm system chose that moment to demonstrate why their conversation was taking place under emergency conditions. A massive downdraft caught the aircraft, dropping them several thousand feet in seconds, while subjecting everyone on board to G-forces that made normal movement impossible. The structural stress was audible as metal groaned under atmospheric pressure that exceeded design specifications, while personal items throughout the cabin became projectiles that crashed against walls and ceilings. Kesha rode the downdraft with the calm competence of someone who had experienced far worse atmospheric conditions while flying aircraft that were actively being shot at by enemy forces. Her control inputs were smooth and precise, using the aircraft's momentum to transition from uncontrolled descent into a powered recovery that brought them back to stable flight altitude. "My God," Brooks whispered, watching her technique with professional admiration. "How did you know that downdraft pattern would create a recovery opportunity?" 10 years of flying through sandstorms and hostile weather systems in the Middle East. Kesha replied, her concentration never wavering from the instrument scan that kept them alive. When you survive atmospheric conditions that don't exist in civilian training manuals, you learn to read weather patterns in 3 dimensions. Dr. Reed looked up from her patient monitoring with expressions that mixed relief and professional curiosity. "Colonel, your recovery technique just prevented the kind of rapid decompression that could have triggered fatal cardiac episodes in Captain Mitchell. That was extraordinary piloting." "Standard procedure for recovery from atmospheric shear in combat zones, Doctor," Kesha replied. "The principles apply regardless of whether you're avoiding enemy fire or natural weather systems." Harold Peterson had been listening to the entire exchange with the satisfaction of someone whose assessment of people under pressure had been confirmed by subsequent events. "Son," he said to Richard Blackwood, whose face had gone pale with the realization of his misjudgment, "I believe you owe the Colonel an apology." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out as he struggled to process the magnitude of his error. His business success had been built on his ability to assess people accurately, and the woman he had dismissed as unqualified was demonstrating competence at levels that exceeded anything in his personal experience. The radio crackled again with communication that would eliminate any remaining doubt about Kesha's qualifications. "Spectre, this is General Hayes with additional information. We have confirmation that your mission record includes successful recovery of aircraft under conditions that our current training manuals classify as unsurvivable. Is it accurate that you guided multiple aircraft to safe landing with complete navigation system failure?" "Affirmative, General." Kesha replied while making control adjustments that kept them stable through wind conditions that were trying to tear the aircraft apart. "When you learn to navigate by atmospheric pressure, differentials, and visual ground reference standard instrument approaches become relatively straightforward. Additionally, we're seeing reports that you completed successful recovery operations while your own aircraft was sustaining enemy fire. Can you confirm those operational details?" Kesha paused her instrument scan for just a moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of memories that she rarely discussed with anyone outside military circles. General, during Operation Tempest Shield, my squadron was tasked with recovering wounded personnel from a forward position that was under active enemy engagement. Our aircraft sustained surface-to-air missile damage that destroyed navigation systems and caused multiple engine failures. She continued her story while simultaneously executing flight procedures that demonstrated exactly why the Air Force had trusted her with their most advanced aircraft. The manual recommended immediate ejection and mission abort, but we had 17 wounded soldiers depending on extraction. I chose to trust physics and experience rather than procedural limitations. Brooks listened with growing amazement as she described flying a damaged aircraft through conditions that would have challenged the most experienced combat pilots while enemy forces were actively trying to destroy them. Colonel, how do you maintain control of an aircraft with multiple system failures under combat conditions? The same way you maintain control under any extreme conditions. Brooks, she replied with a slight smile. You understand that aircraft are simply machines that respond to physical laws, and those laws don't change whether you're avoiding missiles or atmospheric turbulence. What happened to the 17 soldiers? Dr. Reed asked her medical background, making her particularly interested in the human cost of such operations. They all went home to their families, Keisha said simply, her voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who had chosen duty over safety and succeeded. Sometimes the manual gets people killed, and sometimes trusting your training and experience saves lives that matter more than your own safety. The implications of her story hit the cabin like a physical blow. Passengers who had been listening to Richard Blackwood question her qualifications were now understanding that they were in the presence of someone whose decisions under pressure had repeatedly meant the difference between life and death for people who depended on her competence. Richard Blackwood felt something inside him break as he processed the full scope of his misjudgment. The woman he had dismissed as unqualified wasn't just a competent pilot. She was someone whose record of decision-making under impossible conditions was studied by military training programs around the world. General Hayes, Keisha continued over the radio. We need to begin approach procedures for Dover Air Force Base. Our fuel situation is becoming critical, and atmospheric conditions are continuing to deteriorate. Spectre Dover is standing by with full emergency response. All civilian air traffic has been diverted, and you have unlimited priority for approach and landing procedures. Copy that, General. Brooks, I need you to begin descent checklist while I calculate approach angles for single-engine capability. Single-engine approach. Brooks asked, his voice tight with new concern. Are we losing engine power? Not yet, but engine stress indicators suggest that continued operation at current power settings could result in failure during approach phase, Keisha replied calmly. Better to plan for degraded capability than be surprised by it during critical flight phases. Her methodical approach to emergency planning demonstrated the kind of systematic thinking that came from experience with situations where backup plans meant survival and optimism meant death. She was preparing for contingencies that most pilots would never consider until they became actual emergencies. Diana Cross, who had been filming the emergency response for social media, suddenly realized that she was documenting something far more significant than a routine aviation drama. The woman she had assumed was unqualified to handle complex situations was demonstrating competence that exceeded anything she had ever witnessed personally. Spectre. We're also receiving requests from multiple aviation training facilities for permission to record your approach procedures. General Hayes reported. Your navigation technique through extreme weather conditions is of significant interest to our pilot training programs. General academic applications can be discussed after we're safely on the ground. Keisha replied with the professional focus that characterized all her communications. Right now, I need to concentrate on getting 312 passengers through atmospheric conditions that are trying very hard to kill us. The storm system demonstrated its continued intensity by subjecting them to another series of violent wind shear encounters that tested both aircraft structural limits and Keisha's ability to maintain controlled flight. Her responses were so smooth and automatic that passengers later described watching her work as like observing someone who had performed identical procedures hundreds of times under similar conditions. Trevor Nash, who had supported Richard's opposition to Kesha, taking control, was now staring at the cockpit communications with the expression of someone who realized his judgment had been catastrophically wrong. His business experience had taught him to recognize exceptional competence when he encountered it, and Keisha's interaction with Pentagon-level leadership suggested she was operating at levels that few people ever achieved. Brooks initiate descent to flight level 250. Keisha instructed her hands working controls with precision that made complex procedures appear routine. We're going to use the pressure differential below the storm system to stabilize our approach corridor. Colonel, that's contrary to standard storm avoidance procedures. Brooks replied, though his tone suggested professional curiosity rather than opposition. Standard procedures assume you're avoiding the storm rather than using its atmospheric characteristics for controlled descent. Keisha explained, while simultaneously calculating angles that required three-dimensional understanding of weather dynamics. When you understand how pressure systems interact with aircraft performance, you can use atmospheric forces that other pilots consider prohibitively dangerous. Her explanation was interrupted by another radio transmission that would forever change how everyone on the aircraft understood the significance of what they were witnessing. Spectre, this is Commander Rodriguez with priority communication from the Secretary of Defense. Secretary Williams wanted to personally confirm that you have full military support for any procedures necessary to ensure successful aircraft recovery. The mention of cabinet-level attention made it clear that Keisha Washington was not just another military pilot, but someone whose expertise was considered strategically important at the highest levels of government. Richard Blackwood felt his legs give out completely as he realized he had spent the past hour opposing someone whose competence was recognized by the nation's senior leadership. Please convey my appreciation to Secretary Williams. Keisha replied with the calm professionalism that characterized all her communications. Tell him we'll be on the ground shortly with all personnel accounted for. Additionally, Spectre, we're receiving reports that your current navigation technique is being monitored by aviation specialists from NATO countries who are interested in incorporating your storm penetration methods into their own training programs. International cooperation can be discussed after landing, Commander. Keisha responded, her focus never wavering from the life or death decisions required for continued flight operations. Right now, we need to concentrate on approach procedures. Harold Peterson watched Richard Blackwood's complete collapse with the mixture of satisfaction and pity that came from seeing someone's prejudices destroy their own credibility. Son, he said quietly, I think you're starting to understand exactly who you've been arguing with for the past hour. Richard could only nod weakly as the full magnitude of his error became undeniable. The woman he had dismissed as unqualified was not only a military pilot, but someone whose expertise was consulted by international aviation organizations and whose emergency procedures were being studied for incorporation into training programs worldwide. Dr. Reed looked up from Captain Mitchell's monitoring equipment with professional admiration. Colonel, I have to say that your stress management during this emergency has been extraordinary. Most people would be showing significant physiological indicators of pressure response, but your vital signs suggest you're operating in your normal comfort zone. Doctor, when you've flown through enemy territory with people shooting missiles at your aircraft, atmospheric turbulence becomes relatively manageable. Keisha replied with the slight smile of someone who had perspective on what constituted genuinely dangerous situations. The aircraft shuddered through another round of severe turbulence, but this time, passengers noticed that Keisha's control inputs seemed to anticipate the atmospheric disturbances rather than simply responding to them. Her flying technique suggested an understanding of weather patterns that went far beyond anything in standard aviation training. Brooks began final approach checklists for Dover Air Force Base. She instructed her hands working controls with the precision that came from thousands of hours operating under extreme conditions. We're going to execute a single-engine approach profile, even though both engines are currently operational. Why single-engine procedures if both engines are working? Brooks asked, his confidence in her decision-making now complete, despite his confusion about the technical rationale. Because engine stress indicators suggest potential failure during high-power approach phase. Keisha explained while making control adjustments that demonstrated exactly why the Air Force had trusted her with their most advanced aircraft. Better to use procedures that account for degraded capability than be surprised by engine failure during critical flight phases. Her systematic approach to emergency planning was being observed by passengers who were beginning to understand they were witnessing decision-making processes that operated at levels far beyond their personal experience. Everything about her technique suggested training and experience that existed at the intersection of technical expertise and life-or-death judgment. Spectre Dover Air Force Base reports full emergency response standing by. Commander Rodriguez transmitted. Fire rescue, medical, and crash recovery teams are in position with additional support from regional hospitals standing by for mass casualty procedures if necessary. Copy Dover emergency response, Keisha replied. Advise medical teams that we have one critical cardiac patient requiring immediate surgical intervention with all other personnel currently stable, but requiring standard post-emergency evaluation. The calm efficiency of her emergency coordination demonstrated the kind of leadership that came from experience with situations where miscommunication meant death and hesitation meant failure. Her radio procedures were textbook perfect while simultaneously being adapted to the specific requirements of their current crisis. Victoria Blackwood had been watching her husband's complete emotional collapse with a mixture of embarrassment and growing anger at his treatment of their potential savior. "Richard," she said quietly, "I think you need to apologize to Colonel Washington." Richard looked at his wife with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had been shattered by events beyond his ability to process. "Victoria, I don't know what to say. I was completely wrong about everything." "Then maybe you should start by saying that," she replied, her voice carrying the disappointment of someone who was seeing her husband's character revealed under pressure. The aircraft began its final descent toward Dover Air Force Base, and passengers could see through the windows that the storm was beginning to break up as they descended below the worst atmospheric turbulence. Emergency vehicles were visible along the runway, their flashing lights creating patterns that suggested military-level emergency response procedures. "Ladies and gentlemen," Keisha's voice came over the intercom with the calm authority that had characterized all her communications. "We are beginning our final approach to Dover Air Force Base. Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened and follow all crew instructions for emergency landing procedures." The landing itself was a masterpiece of precision flying that demonstrated exactly why Keisha Washington's expertise was sought by international aviation organizations. Her approach was so smooth that passengers later commented it felt safer than most routine commercial landings, despite the extreme conditions that had characterized their entire flight. As the aircraft rolled to a stop on the Dover runway, emergency vehicles surrounded them with the efficiency that characterized military emergency response. Medical teams were already moving toward the aircraft to provide immediate care for Captain Mitchell, while fire rescue teams stood ready to respond to any post-landing emergencies. Richard Blackwood remained in his seat as other passengers began gathering their belongings, his face showing the expression of someone who was still processing the magnitude of his misjudgment. The woman he had spent an hour dismissing as unqualified had just executed an emergency landing that would be studied by aviation schools for years to come. Kesha Washington emerged from the cockpit with the same calm efficiency that had characterized all her actions during the emergency. Her uniform was slightly wrinkled from the stress of flying through extreme conditions, but her demeanor suggested someone who had simply completed another routine flight operation. As she moved through the cabin, checking on passengers, she paused at Richard's seat, where he sat staring at his hands with the expression of complete defeat. "Mr. Blackwood," she said quietly, "I believe you had some questions about my qualifications." Richard looked up at her with eyes that reflected the complete destruction of his confidence in his own judgment. "Colonel Washington, I owe you an apology that I don't know how to make. I was wrong about everything, and I could have gotten everyone killed with my stupidity." "Mr. Blackwood," she replied with the generous professionalism that characterized truly competent people, "your concern about proper procedures wasn't wrong. Verification of qualifications is important in emergency situations. The problem was your assumption that competence correlates with economic status or appearance." She paused, looking around the cabin at passengers who were gathering their belongings with the relief of people who had survived something they thought might kill them. Sometimes the most qualified person in the room doesn't look like what you expect, and sometimes expertise comes from sources that don't match your assumptions about who belongs in positions of authority. As passengers began disembarking, Richard remained seated while his wife gathered their belongings, with movements that suggested their relationship had been fundamentally changed by what she had witnessed. The man she married had revealed character flaws under pressure that she was still processing. Harold Peterson stopped at Richard's seat as he prepared to leave the aircraft. "Son," he said, with the gruff kindness of someone who had seen people learn hard lessons about themselves. "The measure of a man isn't whether he makes mistakes. It's what he does after he realizes he was wrong." 6 months later, the contrast between the trajectories of the people involved in that flight would demonstrate how single moments of decision can reshape entire lives. Colonel Kesha Washington was promoted to Brigadier General in a Pentagon ceremony that recognized her as the youngest African-American woman ever to achieve that rank, while her storm navigation techniques were incorporated into military training programs worldwide. The Secretary of Defense personally commended her service record during the promotion ceremony, noting that she had redefined our understanding of competence leadership and the true meaning of heroism under pressure. 3 major universities offered endowed chairs in her name, while her book, Flying Through Storms, became required reading in aviation programs internationally. Dr. Catherine Reed co-authored a groundbreaking paper with Kesha on emergency aviation medicine that was published in the world's most prestigious medical journals. Co-pilot Evan Brooks was promoted to captain based on his performance during the emergency, and he credited Kesha's mentorship as the defining influence on his aviation career. Richard Blackwood's life followed a very different trajectory. Video of his prejudiced comments during the emergency was leaked on social media, where it accumulated over 50 million views and became a case study in how assumptions about competence and appearance could have deadly consequences. His investment firm lost 80% of its clients within 3 months, forcing him to declare personal bankruptcy. His daughter's innocent question, "Daddy, why do people get angry when they see your name on Google?" completed the destruction of what remained of his pride and social standing. Victoria filed for divorce, taking half of their remaining assets and full custody of their children, telling the judge that she had married someone who confused privilege with competence. Richard found work as a salesman at a used car dealership, using public transportation to get to the job that represented everything he had once looked down upon. Every morning, he passed a giant billboard showing Keisha in her general's uniform with the caption, "Leadership has no color, it has character." During a lecture at the Air Force Academy, Keisha was asked by a young cadet how to deal with prejudice and discrimination. "Let them underestimate you," she replied with the smile of someone who had turned every slight into motivation. "While they spend their energy doubting your abilities, you use that same energy to develop skills they can never question." 3 years after the emergency landing, Richard encountered Kesha at an airport, where she was traveling with a security detail befitting her general's rank. He was wearing the blue uniform of his car dealership, carrying a small suitcase that represented the modest life his choices had created. "General Washington," he said quietly, "I would like to apologize properly for what happened on that flight." Keisha studied him for a moment, seeing not the arrogant businessman from before, but someone who had been genuinely broken by the consequences of his own prejudices. "Mr. Blackwood, you gave me the greatest gift possible that day." "How so?" he asked, confused by her response. "You reminded me why I do what I do," she replied with the wisdom of someone who had transformed opposition into motivation. "Every person I save, every pilot I train, every barrier I break, all of it is possible because people like you exist to prove wrong. Your prejudice became my fuel for achievement." Richard nodded, understanding that her success was the most complete response possible to his assumptions about who belonged in positions of authority. "I lost everything because of my prejudices, General." "No, sir," she corrected gently. "You discovered that you never had anything real to lose. Privilege isn't achievement, respect isn't inheritance, and competence isn't appearance." As she walked away with her team, Richard realized the hardest lesson of his life. The woman he had judged incapable of flying aircraft now commanded entire squadrons while he could barely command his own existence. Keisha's revenge hadn't been to destroy him. It had been to build a legacy so brilliant that his pettiness became irrelevant. Her final words to a journalist summarized the philosophy that had carried her through every challenge. "While they spend time underestimating us, we spend that time becoming unforgettable." The story of Flight 478 became more than just an aviation emergency. It became a case study in how assumptions about competence and appearance could have life or death consequences, and how true leadership emerges from character rather than circumstances. In the end, the woman they looked down on had lifted them all up, proving that greatness doesn't ask permission to shine.